December 1944, the skies above Belgium were heavy with snow and smoke. The winter air bit through the uniforms of every soldier, German and American alike. It was the kind of cold that silenced even the battlefield for moments at a time, broken only by the distant rumble of tanks and the eerie echo of artillery. The Ardennes forest, blanketed in frost, had become a graveyard of steel. But among the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, a new kind of machine rolled into history. A tank the Germans would soon call the Iron Monster that defied the 88, the M4A3E2 Sherman Jumbo, a variant that few on either side knew existed. On paper, it looked like an ordinary Sherman, but its 7 inches of frontal armor turned it into a fortress on tracks. For the German 88 Benemen anti-tank crews, who once believed their gun could pierce anything on Earth, the first encounter with this American beast came as a shock they would never forget. The story begins in the early winter of 1944, when the Allies, pushing eastward after the Normandy breakout, were met with fierce German resistance. The Wehrmacht had been cornered, but not defeated. Hitler's last gamble, the Ardennes offensive, aimed to split the Allied lines, drive to Antwerp, and crush morale before the inevitable collapse. The forests were dense, the weather brutal, and the terrain treacherous. Yet amid the confusion and fog, German armor columns, Tigers, Panthers, and Panzer IVs, moved with deadly precision. Against such firepower, the American Sherman was painfully outclassed. Its armor was thin, its gun often underpowered. American tank crews, brave as they were, knew their best chance at survival was to strike first, flank fast, and pray. But by late 1944, the U.S. Army had learned hard lessons from the fields of Normandy and the hedgerows of France. The need for a breakthrough tank, something that could absorb the 88 BM-100's bite and keep moving, led to the creation of the M4A3E2, nicknamed Jumbo. It was essentially a Sherman on steroids, built with nearly double the armor thickness. The front plate was a staggering 7 inches, sloped and forged to deflect even the deadliest rounds. The added protection made it slower, heavier, and cumbersome, but in the brutal reality of tank warfare, survivability mattered more than speed. When the Jumbos rolled into the European theater, even American soldiers were stunned by their presence. They called them the Beasts, Iron Angels, or simply the Thick Ones. Crews who once dreaded the crack of the German 88 now felt a rare kind of confidence. The knowledge that maybe, just maybe, they could face the feared flak guns head-on. For the Germans, however, these tanks seemed like ghosts, machines that shrugged off direct hits and kept coming. It was December 19, near the small Belgian town of Bastogne, when the myth of German invincibility began to crack. The 88W Meade gun, mounted on the legendary Tiger tanks, and in anti-aircraft batteries repurposed for ground combat, had long been the terror of Allied armor. It could destroy a standard Sherman at over a mile. The weapon's accuracy and penetration were unmatched. German crews took pride in its precision. They believed nothing could survive it. But when the fog lifted that morning, and the first M4A3E2s emerged from the tree line, covered in snow and mud, something unexpected happened. The first 88 fired. The shell screamed across the frozen air and struck the Jumbo square in the glacis. Instead of bursting through, it ricocheted off with a metallic shriek, leaving only a black scar on the armor. The gunner blinked, stunned. He fired again. Another hit. Another deflection. The American tank didn't stop. It roared forward, its turret slowly turning, the 70-feet dumbed Reeve gun lining up a counterstrike. The Germans fired a third time, desperation in their hands, and still the armor held. When the jumbo returned fire, the explosion consumed the German position in seconds. The unthinkable had happened. The 88 had failed. For the first time since the war began, German gunners felt fear not from the number of enemy tanks, but from their endurance. They had been taught that their weapon, their mighty 88, was absolute. But now, as the smoke cleared, they realized they were facing a new kind of adversary. The psychological blow was immense. Reports came in across the front lines, American tanks surviving direct hits, shrugging off fire that once guaranteed death. German commanders at regimental headquarters refused to believe it at first. They accused their crews of poor aim, of hitting at bad angles. Yet the stories continued. The thick Shermans. They cannot be killed. Panic whispered through the ranks. Veteran gunners, who once laughed at Allied armor, now took extra seconds to confirm their targets, afraid of wasting precious rounds on something invulnerable. The jumbos became the silent backbone of American armored pushes during the Bulge. They led the columns through narrow roads, absorbing punishment meant for others. Soldiers followed in their shadow, using them as moving walls of protection. Inside, the crews lived in constant tension. The thunder of artillery above, the claustrophobic heat, and the rattling noise that never ceased. They could feel the enemy's shells hammering against their hull, each impact a reminder that even 7 inches of steel was no promise of survival. One crewman from the 4th Armored Division later wrote in his diary, "Every time that shell hit, we waited to see if we were still alive. When it didn't break through, we looked at each other, not with joy, but disbelief. It was like being given another minute to live." As the Battle of the Bulge dragged on, the jumbos became symbols of resilience. In towns like Nouville, Foy, and Bastogne, they faced some of the heaviest German fire of the entire campaign. In frozen fields, they stood between retreat and annihilation. The 88 Dummen shells continued to come, sometimes at point-blank range, sometimes from hidden woods. Each dent, each scorch mark, told a story of survival. But the psychological warfare was two-sided. For every German gunner who panicked at the sight of a jumbo, an American crew knew they were still hunted. The extra armor made them prime targets. Every tiger, every panther wanted the glory of destroying one. The duels that followed were brutal, slow, thunderous exchanges of fire under gray skies, where seconds determined life and death. When the Americans broke the siege of Bastogne and the German offensive began to crumble, the jumbos rolled forward, their engines groaning, their armor battered but unbroken. German POs captured in the aftermath often asked to see the tanks up close. Many walked around them silently, running gloved hands over the thick steel, shaking their heads. One was overheard muttering, "This is not a Sherman. This is a bunker." The legacy of the M4A3E2 would outlive the war itself. Only a few hundred were ever made, but their presence reshaped the way both sides viewed armored warfare. The myth of the all-powerful 88 bomber was broken, and with it, a piece of the German army's confidence. For the Americans, the jumbos proved that innovation, born from necessity, could turn the tide of battle. Not through numbers, but through resilience. By the time the snow melted in the Ardennes, the once feared 88 crews had learned humility. Their weapon, once the hammer of the Reich, had met its match in a machine that defied all expectation. And for the men inside those iron beasts, the jumbos, they carried with them a quiet pride, not in the destruction they caused, but in the lives they saved. Because on that frozen front, amid the smoke and silence, it wasn't just armor that held firm. It was the will to survive. In the months following the bloody hedgerow battles of Normandy, American engineers faced a grim truth. Their Sherman tanks, though reliable and fast, were outmatched by German firepower. Reports from France painted a haunting picture. Sherman crews ambushed by hidden 80 AWM guns, tanks burning before they could even return fire. Men trapped inside as ammunition cooked off. It wasn't a question of courage. It was a question of steel. The M4s simply couldn't take a hit. Out of this hard reality came a desperate idea: build a Sherman that could. In the summer of 1944, at the Fisher Tank Arsenal in Michigan, that idea took shape. Using existing Sherman chassis, engineers began reinforcing the hulls with thick slabs of steel, adding layers upon layers until the armor nearly doubled in weight. The result was a tank that looked brutish, almost unnatural. Its lines were blunt, its turret swollen, its movement slower. But its purpose was clear: to survive what others could not. The new tank was designated the M4A3E2 assault tank, but among soldiers it earned a different name: Jumbo. Only 254 were produced. Yet every one of them carried the hopes of thousands of tankers who had watched their friends die under the fire of the 88. Its frontal armor was an astounding 7 inches thick, nearly twice that of any other Sherman, rivaling even the protection of the German Tiger. The gun remained the same short 75 mm, chosen not for its power but for its reliability and ease of use. Engineers knew it wasn't meant to outgun the enemy. It was meant to outlast him. The extra armor made the Jumbo weigh over 42 tons, and its speed dropped to barely 22 miles per hour. On paper, it was a liability. But to the men who would take it into battle, it was a miracle of survival. For the first time, American tankers felt they could face German fire head-on. Crews described the first time they climbed inside as stepping into a fortress. The sound of the hatches closing echoed like a vault door. The inside was cramped and unbearably hot, but safety was relative. After months of paper, thin Shermans, this felt like sanctuary. When the first Jumbos landed in Europe in the fall of 1944, they arrived almost unnoticed. There was no fanfare, no press coverage. But within weeks, their legend began to spread across the front. Soldiers whispered about tanks that could take a hit from a Tiger and keep moving. Some doubted it. Others refused to believe such a tank existed. Yet in the coming months, when these machines rolled into the nightmare of the Ardennes, the truth would become undeniable. The Germans, once sure that their 88 WM guns ruled the battlefield, were about to meet a tank that turned their deadliest weapon into little more than sparks on steel. It was the morning of December 19, 1944, near the snow-covered outskirts of Noville, when the first recorded encounter occurred. The fog hung thick, muffling every sound but the grinding of tank trades through the frost. American armored columns, weary from the retreat, began to regroup under the command of the 10th Armored Division. Among them rolled the new Jumbos, their heavy hulls caked in frozen mud. Across the valley, German positions waited. Anti-tank crews armed with the legendary 80 ABM Flak 36, the same gun that had ripped through Allied armor since North Africa. For the Germans, this was familiar ground. They had seen countless Shermans burn with a single well-placed shot. Confidence ran high. The first 88 fired from the tree line, the round slicing through the fog with the deafening crack of a thunderclap. It struck the Jumbo's frontal armor dead center. The impact echoed like a hammer on an anvil, followed by silence. The tank did not stop. It did not explode. It simply kept rolling forward. The German crew hesitated, then fired again. Another hit. The shell bounced off, glancing into the snow. Panic rippled through the gunners. A third shot, closer this time, slammed into the turret. Still, the machine refused to die. The jumbo returned fire, its 75mm round bursting through the enemy emplacement, scattering men and gun fragments across the frozen ground. For the first time, the feared German 88 had failed. It was not an isolated incident. Across the Ardennes, similar reports began to surface. American tanks surviving direct hits that should have obliterated them. German gunners staring in disbelief as their shells deflected off armor they could not comprehend. The 88 BEM, once the terror of Allied tank crews, had met its match. The psychological effect was immediate. For years, the 88 had been more than a weapon. It was a symbol of German supremacy. Its bark alone could freeze a man's blood. Now, that power was gone. German crews began second, guessing themselves, adjusting aim, switching to different ammo types, even abandoning positions out of sheer disbelief. Rumors spread through the ranks about a new, invincible American tank. To the soldiers of the Wehrmacht, this was heresy. Their iron faith in their gun had been shattered. On the other side, the American morale surged. Crews who had once driven into battle expecting death now felt something unfamiliar. Hope. They watched rounds spark off their armor like hailstones on a rooftop and realized they were living what others had only dreamed. For them, the jumbo wasn't just protection. It was revenge for every Sherman that had burned before them. One tank commander wrote later, "It was the first time I saw fear in the eyes of an 88 crew. They didn't understand what they were seeing, and neither did we." By the end of December, stories of indestructible Shermans spread like wildfire. German intelligence dismissed them as propaganda until reports from their own divisions confirmed the nightmare. They called it the thick-skinned Sherman, the Panzerbrecher, the tank breaker. It became a whispered enemy, a ghost of steel that haunted the forests of the Ardennes. In those dark woods, the hunters had become the hunted. The jumbos proved themselves again during the siege of Bastogne. When the 101st Airborne dug in against encirclement, the heavy Shermans from the 4th Armored Division arrived like guardian beasts. Through blizzards and bombarded roads, they pushed forward, leading convoys under relentless fire. German spotters reported multiple hits on advancing tanks, only to watch in disbelief as they continued moving, their thick armor shrugging off rounds that would have crippled ordinary Shermans. The town itself, frozen and battered, became a symbol of defiance, and the jumbos stood at its heart. Inside the tanks, the men felt both invincible and terrified. Every impact reminded them that no armor was absolute. The 88s could still find a weak point, and mechanical failures loomed large. The weight of their machines strained engines, cracked tracks, and slowed movement to a crawl. Yet when enemy shells struck, they stayed alive. And that was enough. The tankers began to trust their steel more than their luck. When asked after the battle how they felt, one gunner replied quietly, "It wasn't that we weren't afraid anymore. It was that for once, the fear didn't control us." By January 1945, as the German offensive collapsed, the legend of the jumbo was cemented. The 88 BEM, the symbol of German invincibility, had met a machine that refused to die. In every battered tank that returned from Bastogne, there were scars that told stories. Grooves where shells had struck and failed, dents that bore witness to survival. German POs often approached the captured jumbos, touching their thick armor in disbelief. To them, it was unnatural. To the Americans, it was the future. In the end, only a few hundred jumbos were ever made, but their impact went far beyond their numbers. They redefined what it meant to build a tank not just for speed or firepower, but for endurance. They changed the rhythm of battle, transforming fear into fortitude. When the snow finally melted and the war's thunder began to fade, the jumbos remained as silent proof that even in the darkest days of the war, innovation could turn despair into defiance. The M4A3E2 had not only saved lives, it had shattered myths, both enemy and its own. And in that frozen winter of 1944, when German 88 Bemem crews saw their shells bounce off 7 inches of American steel, they realized the truth. The age of their dominance was over.